Everybody, my name is Ian Majimsey. I'm actually senior lecturer in education at the University of Birmingham. I've been demoted. So welcome to today's webinar on thinking critically about impact evaluation and accountability in youth work. I am the co-convener of the BERA Youth and Informal Education Special Interest Group with Frances Howard of Nottingham Trent University. And this is a really exciting event for us. This afternoon, we're holding our first events as a SIG since the pandemic put paid to our spring and summer plans. So can I say a special welcome to everyone who's watching, and a special welcome to anyone who's not a BERA or Youth SIG member. Today is both online and free, so I hope that's encouraged some people to join us who might not be on our mailing lists and so on. If that's you, please do stay in touch with us. You can scroll down to the bottom of the screen you can see, and I gather there's a link to the BERA Youth and Informal Education Special Interest Group page. Don't click away yet though. Obviously, we have 5 experts with us today, which is an ambitious amount of expertise to cram into 90 minutes. So we're going to do our best to stick to time. We have Tanya de Saint Croix from King's College. We have Sinead McMahon from Limerick Institute of Technology, Bianca Baldridge from University of Madison, Wisconsin, Louise Doherty from King's College London, and Deirdre Duffy from Manchester Metropolitan University. Now, Tanya is going to be doing an introduction of the speakers and the themes of today's event, so I'm going to not say any more other than a little bit about process. So what we're going to do today is we're going to aim to finish by about 4:30. We're going to be handing over between speakers. Each speaker will speak to us for up to about 15 minutes. There might be a short window at the end of a speaker if they don't take up their whole 15 minutes for quick questions, but there'll certainly be time, we hope, at the end of the session for a longer window of time for questions, comments, and so on. So what I'd like you to do is really to, as we're going through the session, do send questions through on the little bar on the side, and let us, and also upvote questions that you think are interesting and that you want to hear asked, and we'll be reading those and paying attention to them and making use of them, as I say, at least at the end of the session, if not a little bit throughout the session if we have time. During the webinar, everyone's mics are muted other than, and the cameras are muted other than the person that's speaking. So just be aware of that. The other thing I was going to say was there's a little bit of like other interactive stuff, word clouds and so on. Again, everything will be in that sidebar for you to pay attention to that. So I think that's me. I'm going to hand over quickly to Tanya from King's College, and she'll be introducing the themes and all the speakers from the rest of the event. Tanya.
Hi, thanks Ian. It's really great to be here. So yeah, I'm a youth worker by background, and I'm currently working at King's College London. I work with Louise Doherty, who you'll hear from later, on a research project entitled Rethinking Impact Evaluation and Accountability in Youth Work. And as part of our research, one thing we really wanted to do is collaborate with others working on similar themes, whether in practice or in research. And for this symposium, I was so excited to be able to bring together scholars from Ireland, from the USA and the UK to share current research on policy and practice around these themes. And as Ian said, I will introduce everyone at the end. Most of us in this symposium haven't actually all been in the same room before, so we were looking forward to sort of being physically at the BERA conference, but being online is really great in different ways, and one of the things is just being able to welcome more people, and I understand 94 people have signed up to this session, so that's really brilliant, and special welcome to anyone who's not been to BERA before. So yeah, to get through 5 speakers, I guess it will be a bit intense, especially on a Friday. And I don't know about you, but I think this week has been incredibly challenging in so many ways, especially sort of in the wider things that are going on in the world at the moment. So I hope that this will be a sort of good opportunity to get together and discuss some of the themes around youth work and impact and evaluation, and sort of will be an enriching use of our afternoon or morning if you're here from the USA. So special welcome to anyone for whom it's morning. So I'm going to start by just going through a couple of themes that I hope will cut across some of the presentations. And I'm going to start by, I have clicked for it to go forward and it's not doing so, and I'm going to be patient. Anyway, I'm going to start by positioning youth impact as a policy agenda. And what I mean by saying youth impact is a policy agenda is that there's a widespread and dominant view amongst policy actors. And what I mean by policy actors are governments, funding agencies, other influential sort of people or organisations in the youth sector, that there's a need to measure the impact of youth work. So that has become a kind of common sense assumption. We need to measure the impact of youth work, and that this impact measurement is key to accountability in the youth sector. So it's important to emphasise from the outset that this cannot be separated from the political context in which we're living at the moment, which is primarily neoliberalism. And by neoliberalism, at a very crude level, what I mean is the ideology that public is bad, that private is good, and that every opportunity is used to both normalise and perpetuate competition, consumerism, and profit. So what's neoliberalism got to do with accountability? It can perhaps be seen most clearly in schooling, if we think about education, where national and international league tables act together with inspection regimes to create an education marketplace, where even in state-funded education, parents are positioned as consumers and schools are competing against each other. So in youth work, it is a bit different. Internationally, we don't usually have league tables of youth work. We don't usually have inspections. In the English policy context, which is the one I know best as a practitioner and researcher, the dominant means of accountability is changing, is in a period of flux, but has been dominated by neoliberalism for some time. So 10 years ago in youth work, the dominant accountability means was performance targets, such as measuring accredited qualifications or how many young people have got a job, supposedly through engagement in youth work. These targets enabled that kind of comparison and competition between providers, and it had all kinds of sort of deliberate and possibly unintended consequences. Amongst those, one of the most important was a diminishing of informal and open practices of youth work and the funding of that more open youth work, such as youth clubs and street-based youth work. Since that time, the policy landscape has changed, but it has stayed very difficult to fund those informal services. So the focus in youth work is no longer on meeting targets, even if these haven't necessarily gone away. Now accountability is characterised most often by impact measurements. Impact measurement usually means that outcomes are predefined. So for example, a youth project might decide they aim to improve self-esteem, then they measure the young people's self-esteem, usually according to sort of various validated tools and questionnaires before participation in the project and after, which those of you who are youth workers will know, well, that's already a problem, because what's the before and after in a long-term youth work where you hope to have a long-term engagement with young people? Increasingly then, that impact measurement is linked to a calculation of social return on investment. So the kind of claims we're seeing increasingly where projects are saying for every £1 invested in our youth project, you will get a £5 social return. And recently, Ian, who introduced this session, and another colleague, John Owens, and myself have written about this, discussing how evaluation then becomes a site of entrepreneurship, both inside and outside government. New approaches are used to calculate social return. And without going into all of this in much detail, for youth workers, this is all really problematic, not only politically, but also practically. Youth work is a process, it's negotiated and improvised between young people and youth workers. It's not about predefining outcomes in advance, that's already a problem. Youth work is long-term and open-ended, as I said, so the before and after notion doesn't actually make much sense. And reducing that process of youth work to outcomes and to money saved or kind of social return, it perpetuates deficit models of young people while recreating youth work in the guise of financial value and prediction, return on investment, and so on. While all of this has specific effects at a grassroots level, and we'll hear about some of those effects from some of the other speakers today, we also need to understand youth impact as a global policy agenda. because I think from an English perspective, this focus on impact measurement and social return on investment feels quite new to youth workers. A decade ago, when I was a full-time detached youth worker still, we had a lot of targets to meet, but this notion of impact measurement, it hadn't really come in. But in the USA, for example, impact measurement has been a feature of life it has a longer history. And we know that the USA context has been really influential on the growth of impact measurement here in the UK. There's also a longer history of impact measurement in youth programs in the Global South. Not coming from the Global South, of course, it's really something that takes on a bit of a colonial tone here, where development investment is predicated on the measurement of indicators. And where are those indicators defined? Often in the Global North by governments, by so-called experts, by international bodies and corporate philanthropy, for example. In the UK context, youth impact can't really be separated from austerity, or the growth of youth impact as a policy agenda can't be separated from austerity. They sort of came along together. And as one civil servant told me in a research interview, the youth sector struggled to demonstrate its impact. And this was one reason it struggled to attract funding. And this will be recognisable to people from this context, that this was the kind of rationale. You need to measure your impact if you want to keep your funding, which then it does feel that thinking has moved on from that in government and amongst other influential youth sector agencies, and that they now recognise it's not as straightforward as that. And this civil servant said, you know, perhaps there was a view, there was something very straightforward that would help unlock funding. The government has done some learning, everybody's done some learning. And what they mean by that is something around, you know, we now know it is more complicated than that. Nevertheless, the passion for impact measurement amongst influential policy actors, and then the kind of the influence of the Treasury in all of this, which is again something that Ian and John and I wrote about in our article. That means that there is limited room for manoeuvre, even amongst civil servants who can see some of the issues and problems with all of this. And so what we're seeing, I think one of the things here that we're seeing is a bit of a divide between those who are passionate about impact, really believe in it, and then those often practitioners and young people who, some of whom are passionate about it too, but some of whom just think this isn't meaningful to me. So I'm not going to read out this whole field note just because of time, but basically I was at a conference where managers primarily from local government and from charitable organisations who work with young people and children had come along, had paid quite a lot of money to come along to this conference on measuring outcomes. And many of the speakers at these conferences were using words in very taken for granted ways without sort of elaborating. So words like impact, evaluation, measurement were used a lot. And then there's a whole bunch of specialist terms, fidelity, attribution, RCTs, without spelling out what RCT stands for, triangulation, proximal and distal outcomes. These things were thrown around. And so I happened to be sitting at the back of the hall because I got there late. And the practitioners around me at the back of the hall were sort of nudging each other, shuffling around in their seats, and I could hear people whispering to each other, I don't understand what he's talking about, do you? And why I share this, I think, is just kind of to emphasize a bit of a disjuncture, because I think what I'm saying here is it's not a deficit on the part of practitioners who just don't know. I think impact specialists might see it as, those who are passionate about impact might think, oh, it's just a technical matter then of training, of getting everyone on the same page. But what I feel from practitioners, and you'll hear some more practitioner views in some of the other talks today, is it's not just not knowing what those terms are, and it is helpful to know what those terms are, but it's also actually those terms don't feel meaningful to me. That's not how I understand my practice. I think I'll just skim over that one, and just going to do a very quick poll, if that's all right, to just understand sort of we're interested to understand who's come along today. And while you're filling in that, so I know some people have multiple roles, so just maybe tick whichever one you think you're mainly here as. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to introduce today's speakers. So we're going to hear from Sinead McMahon, who's going to talk about the Irish government's use of economic evaluation to assess state funding for youth work. And, oh, sorry, I've gone on to the next slide rather than staying on the poll, but maybe that's fine. I think it's fine. I'm really excited about Sinead's work, which I've had the pleasure of reading, and I am excited about Sinead publishing some of her work. one of the phrases in her proposal for this talk was, we must remain vigilant about what is silenced and lost when the evaluation of work with young people is narrowed to quantified unit cost calculations, which I think is really beautiful and really resonates with me. We're then going to hear from Bianca Baldridge. I'm really excited to have Bianca as part of this panel. Bianca's the author of this book, which is one of my favourite books, very well thumbed, and I've probably talked about it to those of you who know me before. Reclaiming Community, highly recommended. And Bianca's research is around after school programmes in the USA and how they're pressured, and today she'll be focusing especially on how they're pressured to report standardised measures of success that undermine efforts to engage youth of colour in critical reflection on the worlds that they navigate. We're then going to hear from Louise Doherty, who works with me at King's College London, and Louise is going to be sharing some of the data from the project that we're currently doing, some of the young people's and youth workers' views, and talking about an article that Louise and I wrote together that was published a year ago in Youth and Policy on the everyday and remarkable value of open youth work. And then finally, I'm really excited as well to have Deirdre Duffy here as part of our group, and Deirdre's work as well has been extremely useful to me in this looking at this field. I haven't got her book here because it's at my office, but Deirdre's going to be talking about evaluation and governing in the, Deirdre's book is called Evaluation and Governing in the 21st Century, and I highly recommend that book as well. And she'll be talking about critical numeracy and how numbers can be subverted and played with. So thanks for listening. I'm not going to take questions now, just to sort of make best use of time, but if you've got questions for me, either feel free to sort of Google my name and email me anytime, or save them till the end, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Tanya, for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Sinead McMahon, and I'm a social policy lecturer in Limerick Institute of Technology, and I have a background in youth and community work. So in this presentation, I want to explore the use of economic evaluation and value for money devices as a means to govern youth work. And I suppose what I want to do is to try to bring some critical attention to the role that evaluation has played in the reform of Irish youth work in the last number of years. Before I get into the presentation proper, I'm looking for the, before I get into the presentation proper, I'm inviting you to just get involved in this short activity. It's a word cloud, and the prompt is describe, in one word, describe what value for money means to you. So what value for money means to you. So there's just a little bit of a time lag now between the presentation slides and being able to see your responses on screen. No. Okay, so those are some interesting contributions. While the word cloud is building up, what I might do is just share with you the formal definition that the OECD has offered for value for money. Yeah, so the formal definition that they use is that value for money equals reforms which aim for better quality of services at lower costs. And I mean, that's really interesting in terms of the audience contribution, because I think while the issue of efficiency and lower cost resonates with people, I'm not so much seeing, quality is there, but not in as much as our recognition of it being lower cost. So thank you for that contribution, folks. Okay, so in terms of the next 10 minutes, so in the presentation proper, I just want to do a couple of things. I want to tell you a little bit about the study that I'm drawing from today. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of evaluation as a governing tool, and I want to then draw from my study to illustrate some points about the reimagining of youth work that economic evaluation has made possible. So the study itself was a doctoral study that I completed last year with the Department of Applied Social Studies in Maynooth University. It was a critical policy study, so I studied government policy texts, and I used an analytic method by Carol Bacci called What's the Problem Represented to Be, or WPR for short. And I suppose what I wanted to do was problematize government policy. That is, I wanted to critique the government evaluation process that had itself critiqued youth work practice. And so I suppose my study gazed back at policy rather than practitioners, and that was a very deliberate decision. So the anchor for my study was one document, the Value for Money and Policy Review of Youth Programmes. It was published by the Department of Children and Youth Affairs in 2014. And it was an economic evaluation report of funding programmes for disadvantaged young people. I also analysed an archive of about 80 other policy-related texts. Now, why did I pick this particular policy document to analyse? In short, I suppose I chose it because of the role that it plays in what has been referred to by the previous Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, Catherine Zappone, as the most significant reform of youth services ever undertaken in Ireland. I chose to analyse this economic evaluation report because I saw it as a key moment when Irish youth work was held up and made visible as a particular sort of problem, an economic problem that required reform. But you know, policy texts also can tell us something about how we are governed at particular times. And I think this Value for Money review tells us a lot generally about new desires amongst Irish policymakers to open up voluntary organisations and all forms of welfare services in Ireland to a neoliberal or market rationality. And this has been most recently analysed by Murphy et al. Sorry, I went forward there. So in my study, I was interested to use critical perspectives to understand changes in Irish youth work. And so I was drawn to the work of Foucault and governmentality theorists. Governmentality theory is interested in looking at how we are governed in modern society by paying attention to tools, techniques, and ideas that are used to govern us. So using governmentality perspectives, I paid attention to a number of things when I evaluated the when I researched the economic evaluation. I looked at how the evaluation constructs youth work as a problem for policymakers. I looked at the way this evaluation creates new economic categories and new ways to think about youth work and young people. I looked at how this evaluation mobilizes the use of numbers to convince us of its objectivity, and how this economic evaluation silences and replaces older images of youth work that we were once so familiar with. And I want to discuss some of these points now in a little bit more detail. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag there. So for Carol Bacci, we are governed by problems. That is, by the power to shape problems in particular ways. Knowledge production, such as research and evaluation, are key to this framing and production of problems. It's important to remember that prior to the instigation of a Value for Money evaluation process, the Irish youth work sector had been recognised and valued by previous governments in various policy documents with promises of support and investment. For a new Department of Children and Youth Affairs to come in 2011 and to trigger a Value for Money review, in itself already indicated a problematising approach to youth work by a new government. In my analysis, the Value for Money review effectively constructs youth work as problematic for policymakers and funders. It does this by mobilising economic thinking to shape youth work as a set of three problems. In the report, youth work is constructed as a problem of risk, a problem of underperformance, and a problem of proof. For example, there is the reiteration of numerous phrases and terms that are used to frame youth work as suspicious and risky. There are references to youth work as elusive, the youth work relationship as enigmatic, and its outcomes as intangible. The word risk itself appears 73 times. In fact, the fundamental role of a Value for Money review is to problematise, in this case youth work, as an economic risk. the Value for Money review concludes on page 128 that it could not determine the value for money of youth programmes. And in so doing, it produces a lingering sense of suspicion and uncertainty, and it encourages us to see youth work as an economic risk that requires greater governing and control. Another way the Value for Money review report influenced youth work reform is through the production of new economic categories. For example, by using a value for money lens, youth work organisations who were once referred to as partners in older state policy documents are now given new categories such as service providers, contracting agents, and performers. The funding basis for youth work is called into question and problematised. Block grant aid for youth work organisations shifts to a new language of return on investment for outcomes with young people. We're also introduced to a new way to think about and categorise young people, that is, as a risk level numbered 1 to 4, which can be weighted and costed. Youth workers become units of cost for calculating and comparing youth work organisations. In the UK, some of these new economic images of young people and youth work have also been noted and analysed by, for example, Tanya and Ian in their recent article called Feeding Young People to the Social Investment Machine. Thirdly, economic evaluation uses numbers, measurement and accounting technologies as another means to govern youth work. One of the ways that youth work is constructed as a problem in the Value for Money report is that it's not measurable. Paradoxically, it is suggested that poor information from providers inadvertently frustrated attempts to conduct a Value for Money evaluation, but not because there was too little information, rather because there was too much information provided in qualitative form. In other words, the Value for Money report bemoans the lack of quantified and numerical data for youth work and positions previous qualitative reporting as frustrating and unusable. We see the very first construction of a league table for Irish youth work. On page 100, 13 youth work sites are ranked in comparison with each other for their performance using outcomes. Categorising work of this kind has the effect of making youth work easier to control because of the way it normalises economic thinking about youth work and elicits our desire to compete with each other and prove we are better value for money, so that we do not end up on the bottom of that performance table. For as we are warned on page 49 of the report, poorly performing service providers will be replaced with better performing providers. Fourthly, economic evaluation has also sought to govern youth work through various silences. The loudest silence in the Value for Money report is the denial of a youth work identity for the practice that's being evaluated. For example, youth workers are referred to as youth professionals, youth work programmes as youth programmes, and the term intervention is used to describe what we would previously have called youth work practice. In the quote from page 109, we see one of the most recognised aspects of youth work, the youth work relationship, reduced to a generic the relationship. For me, this is one of the most powerful governing effects of the Value for Money report, the way youth work is silenced consistently throughout the document. Starting on page 3, we are informed this is not an evaluation of youth work. Yet there are multiple contradictions here, since the funding being evaluated goes in the majority to youth work organisations. And the 13 sites evaluated were all youth work organisations. What we have is an attempt to conduct a Value for Money evaluation that seeks to assess youth work practice without having to acknowledge that it is youth work practice. It aims to evaluate youth work without reference to its base values, its own theories, aims or principles. This approach subjugates youth work's history and knowledge, and in doing so tells us something about the evaluator's desire to not have to deal with the messy questions of youth work values and professional autonomy. Finally, responding quickly to Tanya's opening presentation and the question of a global impact agenda, in my own study, I also found that there was significant policy travel and policy networking around impact and evidence in youth work. And you can see with the table there on the right that I traced the relationship between the 7 measurable outcomes that are being used in Ireland now. back to the English Young Foundation work and also to the Positive Youth Development movement in the US. And I think that one of the growing effects of this global impact agenda in youth work is that we're seeing a narrowing of what youth work funders are willing to recognize as good or best practice in youth work. And a global standardization, I think, is reducing youth work to a one-size-fits-all practice, cleansed of any uncertainty, fixated on one-to-one work with a therapeutic psychological base, and without any reference to the structural inequalities in society, or without any space for political analysis or action. In conclusion, I would say that there are various ways in which economic evaluations, like the Value for Money Review, have the potential to govern and reform youth work. In the main, the Value for Money Review produces youth work as a site for neoliberal governmentality. And what I mean by that is a place where youth work organisations, youth workers and young people can learn to be primarily economic and competitive agents, and where ideas of social values and public good are silenced. The main achievement of the Value for Money Review is to relocate youth work as an economic concern. This leaves us with critical questions about, as Kylie and Mead have suggested, the integrity of Irish youth work. And without critical attention, much may be lost. The older ideals of youth work as a place to just be, for young people to be themselves without judgment or without profiling, or ideas that voluntary youth work organisations have a role in public good in a democratic society, not just as contracting agents. All of these older ideals are at stake when we reduce youth work to an economic assessment of value for money. And it's my view that we need to continue, as we have today, to critically analyse the role of evaluation in youth work. And thank you for your attention, and I can take questions at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Bianca Baldridge. I'm an associate professor at UW-Madison, and my talk today is going to focus a little bit on the research that I did that led to my book, Reclaiming Community. So the title of this talk is Reclaiming Community in Certain Times, Race and the Politics of Youth Work. I'm having trouble. Oh, there we go. So one of the things that's important about my work and thinking about there's so much synergy between my work and the rest of the presenters is really examining the social and political context of what I call community-based education or community-based youth work, and that the study of youth work cannot be disconnected from the study of systemic inequalities and structural inequality and structural oppression. In the US, there are roughly 10 million young people who are participating in community-based youth work or after-school programs. My work primarily centers on Black youth, and approximately 2.4 million Black youth are participating in community-based youth organizations after school. One of the things that's very important to me is the flexibility and the diversity of community-based youth work spaces. And so in addition to providing young people with academic support, they're also very instrumental in providing social, cultural, and political development for young people. And so I always begin my work in thinking about the role of community in the practice of youth work, in particular for Black communities. So the terms that we use, whether it's after school education or youth organizations or youth work or community-based youth organizations, those terms might be new, but the work, the critical work that takes place within these spaces, within community settings, it's not new, especially within Black communities. Okay. And so I like to center my work in this context because Black communities have always prepared young people to live in a racially hostile, anti-Black world, and that lens for me is critical as I approach my work in the study of youth work contemporarily. And so for today. So what led me to my study in reclaiming community is one, the presence of neoliberalism in the US educational policy context. And there's lots of wonderful research on the impact of neoliberal reforms on schools, on the impact of classroom teachers. And I really wanted to understand how this was shaping youth workers and how this was shaping the experiences of Black and other communities of color, other communities, youth of color in the context of community-based organizations. So I wanted to understand how external political forces such as neoliberalism and the connection between race inform community-based educational spaces engaging Black youth. How do youth workers navigate and negotiate the consequences of market-based educational reforms? And how do community-based youth workers resist these pressures to take up the language of the markets and corporate style approaches to youth programming? And so really quickly, my colleagues did a wonderful job of really detailing the nuances and the nature of neoliberalism. One of the things that I want to contribute to that conversation is the connection of neoliberalism to racism, to racialized framing in particular. And so when we think about neoliberalism as another iteration of capitalism, it's, this idea that embracing the logic that institutions in society will function at an optimal level according to principles of the market. Tanya actually mentioned in part of neoliberalism, the association with private sort of being good, right, and public being bad. There's a racialization a part of that, particularly in the US, and that sort of the idea of public is also sometimes synonymous with bad, right, and Black and brown. Whereas sort of privatization and thinking about private being good is also linked to whiteness. And so for me, in thinking about the ways that the youth work sector in many ways can sort of rely on racialization that is very much connected to market-based logics. And so what happens is that there's more of a racialized framing is more than a description, but it shapes public perception. And for example, when we think about who youth work is for, there tends to be this deficit orientation about who is in need of after-school care, right, or after-school support or youth work support. And what ends up happening is that, it's especially under neoliberal logics, failure, underachievement, things like that tend to rely on sort of blaming individuals or communities for that quote unquote failure. And what ends up happening is that it obscures the structural oppression and various systemic inequalities that sort of shape the conditions in which young people are being educated and in which young people are living. And so in thinking about the research context for my work, I studied a community organization that I call Educational Excellence and located in a northern East Coast urban neighborhood, historically Black neighborhood. It was founded by someone I call Richard Dunn, who is a white man with who's very wealthy and with ties to the real estate industry. And some just important, quick contextual things to know. The organization under the direction of Leah Davis, who really wanted to think about the organization as a college completion and a youth development program. And so that it was both academic as well as youth development, meaning that social, emotional, political support and emotional support of young people was going to be important. That an asset-based framing to the organization was also going to be important to disrupt sort of pathologization and deficit frames that tend to follow Black youth in educational spaces. And students are in the program from their sixth grade, so from about 11 to 12 years old into their completion of high school, as well as through college. That there are a number of academic and elective courses, mental health support, as well as service and cultural exchanges. So the organization initially served over 400 students annually, predominantly Black, and there's diversity in that category. From the US, but then with ties in the US, but then also the Caribbean and Latin American countries as well. And 100% of students graduate from high school, with over 90% graduating college within 6 years. What's also important to know about this context is thinking about the funding structures. And so the primary funder of the organization is the founder. And the organization also receives some grants and foundation support as well, but very, very little support from city government. And so I conducted an ethnography over about a year and a half, and then also completed some follow-up interviews and questionnaires with young people who had participated in the program. I approached my work as a critical ethnographer and critical qualitative researcher, where I do not disconnect the study of the social and political, historical realities of an institution, but also the experiences of my participants, and that those things cannot be disconnected. I'm happy to answer additional questions about my methods in analysis as well, but I do want to share with you some critical findings from my work as it relates to the experiences of youth workers, and primarily Black youth workers. And so there was a period of time when in the organization that was considered to be the golden era. And this is where youth workers and young people alike considered the organization to feel like a family, right? Where there was incredible focus on not just preparing young people academically, but also preparing them to understand the world that they live in, to be critically aware of social and political issues that impacted their lives. And so, throughout the work and throughout my time as a researcher, there was always a reference to the fact that the organization didn't feel like school. And so there are all these wonderful things that the organization was able to do, but there was always a fight there. And so Leah, the executive director, often battled the board, which the board members actually did not reflect the students, and so the board was predominantly white and did not really have a sort of a keen understanding of education. And so there was even a battle and struggle for how to even talk about young people. And so the organization took a stance and called the students in the program scholars or college bound. And here, as you can see, there's pushback that Leah received from board members where they asked her, well, why are you calling them scholars? Like, they're poor kids, they're from the inner city. We want to help them be a part of the mainstream. Okay, so there are all these framing challenges, but one of the things that I think was really important to this particular era was, while the organization tried to make where youth workers tried to make the organization asset rich, meaning that they saw young people for the talents and gifts that they already brought. They didn't feel as though they were empty. They did not think about them in deficit ways. And even though they tried to do this, there were always these external pressures that related to funding and also related to the broader educational policy context that attempted to narrow their work. So, for example, the program, as I mentioned earlier, had a focus on both academic support as well as social, emotional, cultural, and political support as well. But as already is discussed by my colleagues, there's this trend of sort of forcing this organization to think about measuring their success. And their success was always solely measured by tests, test scores, grades, the number of people who were participating in the program. And so here, Faith is actually in charge of the youth development department of the organization. And she described to me in an interview that everything is always about academics. And so while the youth workers in the program understood that young people needed to be supported on multiple levels, right? That not just academically, but socially, politically, emotionally as well, but that in terms of how funders wanted to support the program often led to only the academic programming in the organization. So there's always these funding pressures that were tied to measurement and how to quantify things. And so I want to, in the interest of time, sort of talk a little bit about how this sort of shifted with the proliferation of charter management organizations, and the ability to, and the tendency to sort of think about the success of youth work programs solely based on how many people participate and what you can measure. And so here, another tension that had to be negotiated by youth workers and educational excellence was this competition for funding. And so Leah told me in an interview that there are so many different youth development organizations that were disappearing from the landscape. And so she explains that there are a lot of funders who traditionally funded organizations like educational excellence that will not fund us to the degree that we would like, because charter schools are the hot thing to invest in. And so there's this particular kind of sort of competition around funding, but then also sort of the framing, again, this private-public discourse and this discourse around choice that inevitably ends up sort of, again, blaming communities of color and poor communities for their sort of perceived failure, and which ends up sort of obscuring structural oppression. And so in thinking about over time, how my research captured the way that the organization was shifting according to these external pressures. So after 10 years of serving the organization, Leah resigned for lots of tensions and sort of racist and sexist encounters that she had with Richard Dunn, the founder of the organization. The program ended up hiring someone who youth workers felt just sort of bend to the whims of the board of directors without having any real sense and clear direction about what the program was about, which again was about focusing not just on academic support of young people, but thinking really broadly about how to support young people politically, emotionally, and socially. And so there are a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to in the study. So thinking about sort of these external pressures, from thinking about sort of neoliberalism's dominance within education in the US, and which really led to this, what I call the corporatization of after school, and this focus on expansion. There's also this sort of shift in turnover of youth workers as a result of the ignoring of race by new leadership. And then lastly, sort of thinking about this loss of autonomy. And my work really brings in some really important questions about sort of ownership of community-based youth work organizations, and connections between funding and race, and how these organizations get supported. And so I want to hear, so Ben began as a volunteer coordinator for the division of the program that helps students get to college. Under new leadership, Ben said to me in a follow-up interview that he found out at a staff retreat that the board's new vision for the program was to serve 5,000 students per calendar school year. And he goes on to say that an organization that serves 5,000 students in one school year has very little resemblance to the model that educational excellence had before. And what's important to know about that? So as I mentioned earlier, the organization only served about 400 students annually. And we're talking about really in-depth, a family-oriented, sort of comprehensive youth development organization. And while there's diversity in youth work programs, where there's some community centers that serve young people who sort of drop in, and many thousands of students can come to receive support or services at any time, this organization was intentionally comprehensive, right? And so when thinking about the board's new vision of sort of naming success by serving more students, really fundamentally shifted what the organization was going to be able to do. And so there was an extreme sort of shifting in culture. The organization also began to expand into other neighborhoods, and they actually ended up setting up in a school. When I actually went to conduct this interview with Walida, who was in charge of working with middle school students, to even enter the building, I had to pass an armed officer, right, to get into the school building. And so when we think about youth work organizations in some ways being an escape for young people to sort of leave the harms that they might experience in schools, which have become extremely punitive, and where I argue in my work that, in particular for Black youth, schools can be a site of suffering. And so to then, go to a youth work organization that's supposed to be different, that's supposed to feel different, that allows you to be yourself, but then you have to sort of face an armed guard. So what ended up happening is the character of the organization began to shift, and that led to a lot of turnover. The last thing that I'll talk about, just in the interest of time, is thinking about sort of the corporatization of youth work, and in particular this organization. And so under the change, I found out that it was not just sort of the expansion and sort of the framing around race and around the young people began to shift, but the culture of the program began to change, right? And so it became much more business-like. So Faith in an interview mentioned to me that that there was no laughter allowed. And I was really confused by that. And I asked her what she meant. She said that, people have been going around shushing people and wanting them to be quiet. And so many of the young people who visited began to mention that it became much more business-like and not family-like, and not having a collective family like atmosphere. And so lastly, I think I'm out of time, but I'm happy to talk about some of the implications of this work in Q&A, and really thinking about sort of the paradox that these external pressures of neoliberalism and racism end up having on youth work organizations. But I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi. Hello. So thank you so much, Bianca. That was fantastic and really, really interesting. I just want to make a quick plug for the questions. I'm going to hand over in 2 seconds to Deirdre, but please, as we go, please be, sorry, not to Deirdre, to Louise Doherty, sorry to introduce chaos. So I'll be handing over to Louise in 2 seconds, but just as we go, please do be posting your questions. We want to preserve some time at the end for Q&A. So I know we're bouncing through the presentations, but as I say, please do send your questions as we go, and we can start to give you all a chance to sort of upvote the ones they really like, and we'll pay attention to them at the end. So Louise, I'll hand over to you.
Just check I can get control. Okay, thank you for that. So amazing talk so far. Oh, I can get control that way, brilliant. So as Tanya mentioned earlier on, we are both working on a research study called Rethinking Impact, Evaluation, Accountability in Youth Work. We recently produced an article with our sort of initial musings from this called The Everyday and the Remarkable, Valuing and Evaluating Youth Work. I would really like to, I will be talking about some of, or giving voice to some of the data actually, i.e. the youth workers and the young people. But first, I will just, if I can, talk a little bit about our study. So we are working on a 3-year qualitative study called Rethinking Impact, Evaluation, Accountability in Youth Work. It's funded by the ESRC, and it aims to investigate the youth impact agenda and if and how it's shaping practice, to understand the perspectives and experiences of young people, practitioners, managers, youth workers, in relation to the value of youth work and how youth work is evaluated, crucially, and to consider and share approaches to evaluation that are appropriate, sympathetic to youth work practice. We're currently in the 3rd and final year of this study. Oops. Sorry. So just to briefly, position our focus as open youth work, because I'm mindful that not everyone will necessarily be youth workers or have youth work experience. So our research focus is open youth work. And by this we mean spaces for informal education, where young people learn through conversation, activity and relationship with youth workers. Young people would experience this in settings where they interact with youth workers, such as youth clubs, detached street-based work, community hubs, and increasingly online spaces. Open youth work as a practice encourages young people to get involved on a voluntary basis through a voluntary association. So rather than being referred, targeted, or compelled to take part. Whilst there may be boundaries around age, shared identity or experience, or by group agreement, it is actively open and youth-centred in terms of the timescale, the activity, and the outcome. So in relation to valuing and evaluating youth work, there is a tendency to undervalue the need for young people to have autonomous spaces to socialise and or to be alone with others. In that sense, the everyday and the remarkable impact of youth work can go unseen. For many young people involved in our research, the youth club or youth space was a home from home, a safe space, a place of sustenance, somewhere to be alone or to be shared with peers or with youth workers. From that perspective, open youth work offers an everyday space for young people. Yet we found that youth work spaces are also remarkable, truly remarkable, often having an extraordinary impact on young people's lives. Youth work can be life-changing, life-saving, or life-enhancing, and it really seeks to recognise and acknowledge each young person's lived experience on their terms. So during our research, our interviews and focus groups, and just to put a quota here, all of the quotes are from the research, and they've been fully anonymised. I realised I hadn't included that. So during project visits and research interviews, we were really struck by the remarkable examples of the impact of youth work, as well as by the rich and meaningful nature of everyday youth work practice, and we reflect on this in the article. Young people and youth workers have interactions based on mutual respect and trust, and we found young people were really keen to talk about this. So to give voice to some of the silenced, I'd really like to quote some of our data sources. Tolu, a young person from Melham Youth Service, said, "They try and almost relate and like approach us in like a different perspective, from like maybe a teacher who's like hard and like tells you what to do. They're almost like, I don't want to say like humble, but they put themselves down to almost see us from our point of view. They don't restrict us ever. They liberate us, allow us to be free." So quite profound statements coming from the young people. So with this growing focus on proportionate and equitable evaluation within and beyond youth work, how can we ensure that evaluation is more clearly rooted in the needs and realities of practice? And Tanya and I are obviously working on this together and reflected on this in the article. And to that end, we propose or start to muse on these three questions to consider. Does evaluation suit the setting? Does evaluation reinforce or challenge unequal power relations? Does evaluation capture and value the everyday and the remarkable? So I'll now briefly look at each of these. So does evaluation suit the setting? Youth workers we interviewed were not arbitrarily against evaluation. Many saw it as its value as integral to reflective youth work practice when it was informal, appropriate and flexible. For example, Polly, a youth development worker from the Vault, said, "We always ask them, what could be better? I think that's the one thing we quite thrive off as a team. There's always something that will be better. And I think for me, knowing that helps us change our process." So poignant here that youth workers, when we teach youth work, I teach youth work at Goldsmiths University, we constantly consider this reflective practice and process. Yet inappropriate or arbitrary data collection mechanisms are also experienced. For example, Sophie, a youth work manager from Melham, observed, "I think that local authorities in general are obsessed with data, but we don't learn from data. I mean, we can learn from data, but we don't. It's just this mass collection of stuff. I feel like Melham collects and collects and collects and collects, and then I just don't know what we do with it." So given that quote was from a youth work manager, it's important, crucial to remain vigilant to the purpose of data collection, and of course critical to the methods used in youth work settings. And we might ask, is it appropriate and necessary? What happens to data collected? Many youth workers we interviewed were unsure as to what happened to this data, and how does this inform meaningful evaluation? There seem to be missing links between what's collected and what it's used for. And how are young youth workers and young people involved in actually steering this? They are, to all intents and purposes, the silenced voices, as you know, Sinead was alluding to. Some suggestions for what might work: taking an intentionally flexible approach to methods available and used in different settings. For example, a toolbox or a menu of options rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. And we might think of some appropriate tools like touch questionnaires, creative methods, and we'll think a bit about that later on as well, or methods such as storytelling workshops. So does evaluation challenge or reinforce unequal power relations? Young people told us about the importance of acceptance for who they are and the safe spaces and freedoms offered by youth work and youth workers. Tracy, a young person from Riverpath, said, "It's like creating like a safe and comfortable environment for them to come to and feel like they're kind of free from prejudice or any negative forces outside, like in the wider society, and just have that space for themselves that they can use to the best of their ability." So this safe space theme revealed itself to be particularly important, or continues to reveal itself to be particularly important, given many marginalised young people's experience of surveillance culture, oppression, monitoring and questioning at school, on the streets, and in many other aspects of their daily lives. Possible responses to this: evaluation as a way to challenge unequal power relations in the sector might be to really refocus and revive youth work's rich histories of anti-oppressive practice. Embed democratic processes in our organisations. Do young people, volunteers and employees feel listened to and involved? Is this demonstrable? Also, what can the sector learn from ethical research methods, practices and approaches? So finally, does evaluation capture and value the everyday and the remarkable? Perhaps one of the most poignant and arguably difficult to locate themes emerging from our research is this question around capturing the value of the everyday and the remarkable in youth work. Young people we interviewed were incredibly articulate when it came to expressing this. Tracy, a young person from Riverpath, said, "It's sort of like an escape from everyday life because you have the monotony of school and being at home, but it's somewhere extra that you can go and meet up with people or talk about things that you won't want to talk about with people from school. If you have an issue, you have somewhere to go and talk about it, just this little extra space away from everyday life." Whilst another young person, Patricia from Opal Youth Club said, "If any young person was in danger or they had no place to go or no friends, they'd be able to come to Opal and make friends and actually build a family. Because there's those who might have nothing or have no one." So these sort of joint themes of the everyday and the remarkable was acknowledged and valued by young people. And it seems to be located somewhere between the attitudes of youth workers, the nature of the youth workspace itself, and by the feelings and behaviours of young people and other young people when they enter that space. And how do we capture this? and recognise its impact. So possible responses might be to build awareness and deeper understanding of the practice by supporting youth workers and organisations to communicate well through appropriate, informal and flexible forms of evaluation, to ensure evaluation is meaningful and contributes towards the quality of practice and the experiences of young people, and perhaps to broaden the methods used in evaluating youth work, and to really draw on the practice to speak about itself, and perhaps draw on critical evaluation tools too. So to that end, I hope that we have a little poll looking at, in your experience, what creative research methods might be appropriate, sympathetic to better demonstrating the value of practice in youth work evaluation. And I'll just let it, whatever's happening, happen. Ooh, I'm not sure if I'm meant to be speaking through this part, so I'm sorry. I'm just like really interested in what's popping up. Okay, so we're having things posted like storytelling, photo voice, filmmaking, young people's stories, informal checkouts, narrative inquiry. Filmmaking is good, creative writing, listening, interviews with known youth workers, case studies, sharing experience, focus groups, life stories, participatory approaches, some really rich stuff there. Okay, so that is actually it for me, and I'm kind of glued to this now. Oh yeah, and you can find more about our research, rethinkingimpact.com, little plug there, sorry.
Talk about a bit is built on some of my earlier work, as Tanya mentioned at the start, that I wrote about in my work on evaluation and governing. I'm not from a youth work background. I am from an excessively geeky background, though. And my starting position really in terms of this debate has always been quite critical of neoliberal agendas and of some of the issues that my learned colleagues and fellow panelists have so eloquently illustrated about how we can silence a lot of the richness of youth work through an evaluative agenda, or alternatively, how you can try and invisibilize some of the racialized thinking and systemic inequalities that are surrounding young people, and through portraying youth work as kind of a way to resolve a problem rather than something that is meant to enrich and support young people's lives to become critical thinkers in their own life. So I don't want to revisit the arguments that my fellow panelists have made, but to use this as an opportunity to tentatively reach out to some counterpoints to some of the arguments that I have made before, particularly around the use of numbers and this question of impact, which I think dominates a lot of critiques of evaluation, is that it is overly based on clarifiable, quantifiable, and specific forms of data. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is two things. I'm going to look briefly at some of the core arguments against evaluation using these kind of numerative approaches, but then propose a way that, rather than, as I have and others have advocated, and Louise has given some great examples of alternative ways to conduct evaluation, how we might reclaim the forms of evaluation that are being forced on people, and what I like to call is mess with them. So I'm going to start with a question that's really are people seeing this question? I'm not quite sure, Bianca, here. So what I'm really trying to see is what do people think of numbers when they see them on in evaluation. What do they mean to people? And to understand, and I'm going to let this run for 30 seconds, but I'm not actually seeing the responses to this. Could somebody chip in, Ian, maybe if you're seeing the responses to this one? I need to leave the poll. It doesn't, okay, so the poll isn't working, okay. Well, let's skip on, because, so what I wanted to do was the question around evaluation and impact is that at this point we've established fairly well within the literature and within the research that the others have presented that impact is part of an agenda, that it's embedded and influenced by various other political movements that have been emerging over the last 20 years, certainly 30 years, and we've now seen that it's a point of evaluation isn't to synthesize what is valuable about youth work, but to govern it from outside and oriented in particular directions. And this is underlined by specific ideologies. In the UK context, is underlined by new public management, by managerialism. But it's worth noting that part of our I know my own critiques, speaking reflexively, part of my critiques of evaluation have come from a position that something that is about numbering the outcome of a relationship is flawed thinking. And it has an impact on social spaces because it makes us start to think about how many people walk in a door or how many people achieve high outcomes, whatever that might be, rather than about the relationship in social spaces or about the systematic and systemic oppressions that exist outside those spaces. So focusing on this question of governing through numbers, there are three core arguments that emerge within the literature. My screen has gone bananas at this point. So, so there are three core arguments that stand out. The first is put forward by Christopher Hood and others, which is about the emergence of target world. I've stopped seeing my own presentation again. We're in target world, which is where we exist now. Evaluation is used as a way to orientate the thinking of practitioners towards particular outcomes which they themselves may not value. And this can be used through the mechanisms of performance indicators, for example, and a specification to and a demand for them. Tanya's saying, keep going, what I'm saying is great nightmare technology. Thanks, Tanya, for that chipping in. So the argument of Christopher Hood makes is that is that over time what we've seen is people oriented through technologies in global contexts which are intended to force them to meet a particular strategic target that's set from above. And even though, as Tanya pointed out, in the last 10 years in youth work, we've supposedly seen a move away from performance indicators, Hood's and others' recent writing on target worlds and performance evaluation suggests that this is a movement away in wording, but not in reality, that targets are still there. And the key thing in the target world conversation is that target and terror are used together. So it's not just that they exist in some kind of vacuum, it's that they're associated with a particular feeling of insecurity and precarity, which is particularly insidious for youth work as a sector, because the sector is so dominated by economic precarity of its workers and practitioners. So to use target world is really a manipulation of a lot of their own capacities to contribute in a meaningful way. The second argument that I make in my book that explores the purpose of this global evaluation agenda, as Sinead so neatly put it, is that part of the purpose of evaluation is to focus on a single message. Now, this is something that I put forward as stemming from information communication theories. And if you look at information communication theories, there is a significant movement, has been a significant movement over time to articulate single messages and to cloud out the noise. And this, I feel, is a really significant argument when it comes to youth work, because in 2010, the House of Commons Education Committee's review of youth work, and Sinead's, as Sinead pointed out, in the Irish government, the Republic of Ireland government, made the same arguments, that there was too much evidence, but not the right kind of evidence. So part of the evaluation agenda was to cloud out and articulate a single message. Now, this again is quite insidious and quite troubling for youth workers, because there is no way to synthesize or to articulate all the contributions they're making, on the one, firstly, and secondly, when you come out with these statements by policymakers and policy actors that we need to have an evaluative framework so we can identify what matters, then we are silencing all of those statements. So all of the submissions to those reviews, which policymakers said were not real evidence and not worthwhile and didn't demonstrate anything valuable about youth work or the youth profession, by discounting them, they're discounting the people who submitted them. So those youth workers, professionals, young people's voices are effectively thrown out in favor of a very stringent set of measures. So the third effect of the evaluative agenda, and the third critique, is that it's part of not just neoliberalism, but what Whitehead et al. Called neuroliberalism. Now, neuroliberalism is something that I came to quite latterly, and is linked to what we might call in the UK the nudge hypothesis. It's probably the one that we experience the most on a daily basis, because it connects governing to our emotional sensibilities and our sense of self. So it's the exercise of control by way of manipulating, as target world does, guilt, fear, disappointment. And what's particularly problematic and troubling for me is that you see this orientation through emotional mechanisms and through manipulating those coming as part of people's ordinary language. So people will talk about emotional intelligence and resilience without compunction, but these forms of emotional, in that phrasing, when you talk about resilience, achievement, emotional management, what you're effectively telling people is to quieten down where your complaints, whatever those complaints may be, we don't want to hear them. And embedded within the evaluation agenda in saying, tell us what's good about your service, show us the good outcomes, is not allowing people to speak about the bad outcomes. And recognizing badness is a really critical part of youth work, because what you're doing through a youth work conversation, which is politically oriented, isn't asking people to say what's good about your life, but in a context like the US, as Bianca is speaking, is to make people more aware and in a position where they're able to articulate quite clearly how racialized forms of oppression are active and present. So by the neoliberal mechanism of focusing people in on a good thing, a sense of achievement, is from the critical position that I came from, a way to get people to shut up talking about all of the bad things in the world and really stepping outside what youth work was trying to do. But this is where my problem began, because I was being quite critical, and a lot of these critics, I think, are well founded. I defend their position that we do see professionals being regulated through a fear of numbers, that we do see an attempt to synthesize on targets which may not be ones that youth workers, young people, or their communities need or want to pursue, that we do see a nudging along and telling people to focus on developing resilience rather than developing resistance, which are two different things. But what came to me quite latterly was in reading about this question of, are my critiques balanced? And coming from a qualitative ethnographic perspective, where I was encouraged to be reflective, right? And it occurred to me over time, I was not reflecting in my attitude towards numbers or numbered thinking. Instead, what I was doing is complaining about them. So I began to start reading around some of the alternative thinking that has emerged within anthropology and science and technology studies around critical numeracy, and perspectives like quant crit, femquant, which I'll come to in a second, which are super exciting and super interesting. And really, rather than suggesting developing alternative means of evaluation, provide an insight, I would argue, to take back numbers in a way that allows youth work to articulate its value without having to play a game that's dictated from above. I want to start with actually a quote that struck me as really meaningful on my road towards this, which is from Hedgeson, and he's looking in the context of randomized controlled trials, which from an ethnographic or youth work perspective, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are, who knows, are kind of the kiss of death, really, for any kind of criticality, and really resistant towards them. And I myself have been super critical of them in the past. But writing in the context, Hedgeson noted that clean data is actually the dirtiest data of all. And it's the one that governments, policymakers, and professionals are most skeptical of. So anything that professes to have the number, the value for money demonstration, the economic point, is dealt with skepticism, because the reaction is, what have you done to this data to make it so clean? Because life is messy. And if our starting point for numbers is that, oh, they try to clean these up, then there is a conflict in our attitudes for those who value economic measures. The fact that they are saying, well, things can't be too clean, and we're saying, but you want us to clean things out. So there's some kind of complexity there, which interests me about it. And I was struck in Louisa's presentation about participants, quote, on what's the point in collecting, why are they using this data, and a skepticism of, is this about cleaning and sanitizing, because that in itself is dirty work. So there are two arguments here on numbers that I want to raise, and this is part of an ongoing thinking on my part, and I appreciate what others had to say on this point. There are two things I want to point out. The first is the contributions of Helen Varane and others on numbers as an inventive frontier. Now, numbers are undoubtedly the fundamentally inventive frontier from a Foucauldian perspective and governmentality, they are productive. And we see that how numbers produce a reality. The quintessential example of that is the population. By counting a population, you are constructing a country, you are constructing a society. And Bianca's presentation has struck me as particularly important in demonstrating how enumerating a group constructs them as a group with a particular identity. So numbers are productive. There are also mechanisms for governing, because when you associate something as having an identity, a group identity, it has a set of rules and things that need to be applied to them. So there's the critique of why we shouldn't number things. But Helen Varand's point, and the point of others like Celia Lurie, is actually we should reclaim that thinking. Ian's going to jump in here and tell me to shut up, I feel, in a second. Is that if something's inventive, then we should be able to think about it differently, and we should be able to reclaim and produce things in different ways. And this leads me to the final point that I'm going to make about how to make numbers critical. Is to, and even things like value for money arguments, how to make things critical, is that comes from, and this comes from lecture on feminist quantitative or femquant and quantitative critical studies, where they talk about if you use a number, you illustrate a particular gap in society or form of oppression. It's interesting actually that some of the literature on quant crit has come where it's focused on counting the number of absent voices from Black, Indigenous and people of colour within certain systems, or the numbers of people dying in police custody, to show the persistence of systemic racial inequalities. So this leads me to a fundamental question for everyone. We have come to a point where we're talking about impact agendas and evaluation as inherently problematic and how we can undermine them. But what if we could recalibrate them? What if we could orientate them towards alternative political projects? Now, this isn't as straightforward and sustained reflection, but I want to advocate at the end of this is to say that we play with numbers, the ones we have problems with, and how can we do that? And that's me.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, that was really confused because I panicked. The technology broke. Oh my God, so embarrassing.
Thank you so much. I think you did fabulously well given tech problems, and I really appreciate that. And sorry for the technology. Look, we are like after 4:30. We promised we finished at 4:30. So let me get in like 2 questions, right? 2 relatively short ones. And I'm going to try and locate them and do a little bit of, work to kind of bring together a few different questions. One of the, and actually they pick up, Joji, on some of your final points. One of the things that I think we, across the pieces we talked about was the global nature of some of these issues. And one of the things that became clear, we're talking about different locations, different places, these feel global. And that leads us to questions, and people were asking questions about the nature of change in that case, which obviously is where you kind of left off. So one location that Joji, you were talking about was, look, we do different things with the numbers. We treat them, we understand the numbers differently, and we look for kind of possibilities, political possibilities in doing things with the data. And understanding the data and representing it in particular ways. I think that's sort of where quant crit somewhat is, and I really recommend. I love quant crit literature. It's fab. Dave Gilborn's in our department, and he's like great. So what I wanted to ask was, from the other side, then, does the global nature tell us something about can policy change? Like, where does responsibility lie here? Is it possible for policy to change in this kind of globalized neoliberal regime? Is that a possibility? Or do organizations have responsibility here to do things, either perhaps to forego and refuse funding is, one kind of radical option, or is another option, to think critically and to develop critical accounts of data itself? Like, where does responsibility for change lie here? Go.
I can try to say something quick. I'm not good at saying something quick. Yeah, I think, it's a brilliant question. And the answer, my answer would probably be sort of a bit of all of those things. I mean, I'm interested at the moment in, because I just always do think there's that sort of clearly we need a fundamental restructuring of society. We've got a horrendously oppressive system that we're living in, and that's the main thing. But then it's like, in the meantime, we've got to live in this place, haven't we? Whether we're youth workers, we're in organisations, and whether we're researchers. So I think sort of thinking critically about these things is vital. I really like and appreciate what everyone said today, and sort of just thinking about Deirdre bringing up about the sort of emotional aspect of this, of sort of being told to quieten down and not talk about the difficulties. So for me, I suppose I'd start from, you know, as a practitioner, as a policymaker, as a researcher, I think making these difficulties visible is part of it. And then, yes, looking for what do we do then, and let's play and let's resist and let's fight as well. That's all kind of needed. Yeah, I'll stop there because.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
Can I just say, I agree with that. I also just want to say that I think I've always had sort of hope by the subversive nature of many youth workers in the context of these organizations as they're fighting sort of external policy pressures, or even pressures from their organizations as it relates to funding and other things. But the ability of youth workers to be subversive and resist in all kinds of ways, I think that that pushes back, right? That brings about a lot of change when they refuse, or when they put the humanity and dignity of young people first. So I'm usually inspired by that.
I think it's where some of your kind of like the neoliberal and the dynamics of feeling that are involved around numbers for people working are really, really important. I think also brought up for me, like we often think of this, things you're saying in terms of like the technologies of the measures themselves often, or the ways they produce numbers. And actually I wonder, Bianca, I think it was your phrase, where charter schools were the hot thing to fund right now. And like there are big network effects here, like big policy network effects that are the kind of that are kind of fairly emotional and relational and all of that, and are much more affective than they are kind of about the technologies of the numbers, right, and objectivity, or whatever that might mean. But one last question before I let people go, and I'll start rambling. The other kind of theme I think was about positive roles for evaluation in relation to young people's dignity. I know Louise, you talked about anti-oppressive practice and listening and some of those. I just wondered if people had anything else to say about kind of potential positive roles for evaluation.
I mean, I think the history. Sorry, Louise. Sorry.
Go on, please.
I mean, I think in the history of youth work, you know, evaluation has always been something that youth workers have been involved with, particularly, as Louise mentioned, embedded in reflective practice, which seems to not resonate at all with policymakers. But I think some interesting ones, I think people mentioned in the word cloud activity for Louise as well, the narrative inquiry approaches and most significant change is a really interesting evaluation tool now that offers a positive way to engage with evaluation in youth work practice. You know, so there's many, I think, models out there for us to use. I think maybe it's to encourage local organizations to bring them to the fore. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, can I add something to that? Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of say that I think that there's this element of the sort of the potential for political subversion that youth work actually brings, and that leads to it being suppressed by guns, as we're all talking about. So that's really the crux of why we have this sort of denial of the messiness and the beauty of what life and youth work actually is, and the insistence of turning it into something it's not. So just to revert maybe to that point, I think it's important for us as researchers, academics and practitioners to continually sort of batter at that door by reminding people that youth work already has these answers within, and it is about revealing those voices and giving voice to the silenced. So.
Can I just jump in? Is that because it strikes me as interesting when we talk about and a lot of our critiques and people's fears, I think, around evaluation are based on perhaps the fact that it is something from outside trying to take everything that is good and valuable and generative about this reflexive practice and take it, as Sinead pointed out, into a completely different direction. So I think there is some resistance that youth workers, and I'm always impressed about their creativity in ways of finding to do this, of resisting those agendas, whether that be to, for example, if you wanted to take the data, show us your impact, is to show not your impact and say that actually, despite this investment, despite this charter schools movement, despite all these pushes, you still have these lag figures, and this can't just be explained by poor professionalism on our part because we've done our job. And that in itself, articulating that message, I think, is really resistant to a value for money agenda, for example. But yeah, that I'm not sure that thought led in a direction. I'm still traumatized by the technology, which seems very apt.
Listen, on that note, can I say thank you to everybody who's participated today? I mean, just 5 really brilliant inputs. Thank you so much.